Hey friends, you're listening to the Hope and Hard Pills podcast, where we are pursuing practical insight about racial justice and social change. I'm your host, Andre Henry.
I'm Corey Leak.
And Corey is filling in for Alicia again for the second time. Don't worry, Alicia is coming back.
Don't worry, everybody. This is the last time you'll hear me.
Yeah. It's not the last time. Anyway, we have an exciting show for you today. We're talking with activist, educator, and blogger Zellie Imani. And I have been following Zellie for a long time, and I wanted to talk with him specifically about a question that I'm constantly pondering, and that is, what do Black people need to do in the pursuit of racial justice? What does it look like for us to fight for racial justice? I think, Corey, you understand this. And I didn't know this beforehand. If I knew this beforehand, I would have planned a little bit better. But as a Black man, when you start talking about racism, you're going to attract a lot of white people.
Yes.
It's just a part of the thing. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Shout out to all of the white allies and accomplices that are seeking to be anti-racist and to fight for racial justice. But I just didn't realize that it would attract so many white people. And so later on down the line, I started realizing that we have some different questions, when we're talking about racism. Mm-hmm. And there are actually some ways that I can't help white people.
Yeah, exactly.
and there are some ways that white people can't help us.
Yes.
And so that has had me thinking a lot. And we could talk some more about this later, because there actually was a moment a couple years ago where I literally, I sat in my apartment and was like, something has to change. Especially because I was focusing a lot on the white opposers, or I was not focusing on them, but I was giving them a lot of energy.
It's hard not to, because they're relentless. Yeah, they just keep coming in waves and coming and coming and coming. It's hard to just ignore them, for sure.
You know what I saw when you said that was that scene in Lord of the Rings where all that huge army starts coming down over the hill. Because you attract those kind of white people too.
You absolutely do.
In hordes. So, okay, let's get into the interview with Zellie, and then Corey and I will come back and we'll talk some more about this. Without any further ado, here is our conversation with Zellie.
No, it doesn't have to be. Doesn't have to be this way. Doesn't have to be. No, it doesn't have to be this way.
Hey Zellie, how's it going?
Yo, it's going great, brother.
Yo, it is so good to have you on the show. I'm so honored that you gave us this time, man. Thanks for being here.
No, thanks for reaching out and having me. I'm real excited to be on the show today.
Yeah, for sure. I am excited to share your brilliance with all of our listeners, and hopefully they'll share it with everyone, because y'all need to be following this guy if you're not on Instagram and Twitter. He's dropping truth every day. So Zellie, here's an interesting thing is I think when people look you up online, it's hard to describe you in one word, because you're doing so much work, so many different ways. So I wonder, how do you describe yourself and what you do?
Man, that's a great question. I know online, I definitely try to categorize myself as a brother, as an educator, and as a writer and activist. But all those things that I kind of use to describe myself, in the notebook, I'm just a human being. And the things that I'm fighting for is to end all these types of oppressions in order to fully be a human being. Because all these different types of systems of domination that are working to oppress us really limit our capacity to really fully live the lives that we deserve. So the fight that I'm fighting is to liberate us all so that we can really fully be human beings. And that's what I really am. And that's what I want to be.
Word. So I wonder, have you always been politically active, or how did you get into doing this kind of work?
It's always been this push and pull thing. My family, particularly my mother and my father, they grew up as Black activists. So when they both met in college, they was a part of the Black student movement out here in the East Coast. Back then in the 70s, when they was taking over Bursar's office and Registrar's offices, really fighting the fight, trying to get an increase of Black student population, an increase of Black faculty, pretty much the same things that we're still fighting for today. So that type of activism pretty much trickled down into my household, so that when I got into college, I kind of followed that same path.
Wow. And so it's in your blood, kind of.
It was in my blood. It was annoying growing up as a kid, like every day I'm expecting the toys in my room. There's like books on Black history. I'm like, damn, I want a toy. Not a book.
Oh my gosh. So, but looking back, it sounds like you're grateful for that experience.
Yeah, I really am grateful, because I got the chance to be knowledgeable about a lot of historical figures that my peers at that time really wasn't, knowledgeable on. They just knew about, the Martin Luther Kings and the Rosa Parks, but I was exposed to so much more.
Yeah, that's so true. Tell me about the work of Black Youth Collective.
Yeah, so I'm part of I founded an organization called the Black Liberation Collective, which is a network of college-based organizations throughout the United States as well as Canada. And we pretty much emerged in 2015. I think at that time, again, right, where a lot of college students were actually starting to communicate to one another. Because at that time, what they always do when there's an incident on campus, whether it's like a blackface incident or some other type of racist incident like nooses, the college administration, they always try to say like it's an isolated incident, right? Mm-hmm. But all these college students are saying, wait, this happened on my campus too, or this happened on my campus too. And it becomes a conversation. This is not an isolated incident, but something systemic. And in order to fight something systemic, we all have to be fighting it together collectively on our own campuses.
Yes.
So we was able to build like a strong network and have national days of action where we was able to hold rallies, hold sit-ins. Like Princeton had like a sit-in of like multiple days in the president's office. Yale had like sit-ins, all fighting for the same radical thing. Like, we still want to increase our Black students. We still want to increase our Black faculty. We need more funding for our Black organizations. And if we at here in Howard, right, we should be invested in our local community. Like we shouldn't just be getting like tens of thousands of dollars here. We should be able to invest it into this local community as well. So all these different conversations were happening, especially something right now when we talk about reparations, right?
Right.
That we started had that conversation about, like Black people deserve free tuition for college and technical school.
Word. And I love that you're talking about organizing, because I feel like a lot of people are not taking the possibility of collective action seriously. And I mean, like you mentioned, like in our tradition as Black people, like, our ancestors were organizing. That's how we even have the freedom that we have today. And so sometimes I look at it and I wonder, sometimes I feel like we're stuck. You know what I mean? I'm like, so could you talk about first off, I want to know like how you see, where we are as Black people, but also the importance of organizing. Could you speak to that for a little bit?
Yeah, I think it goes back to our earlier conversation about some people only knowing certain names of Black historical figures, right? Mm-hmm. And that is something that's purposeful. And even the figures that we do know, like a Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks, is completely whitewashed. So the only thing we know about Martin Luther King is like the speeches, right? Or things like the I Have a Dream speech, and maybe like the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act. But we don't know necessarily the organizing that took place behind the scenes to actually get those demands met or get those bills passed. And that's the thing that's really missed, because without knowing the organizing aspect of a lot of these things, a lot of us think that things just happen automatically, or that someone has to be charismatic and a great speech giver in order to give us our demands met. But in actuality, it's like the organization of masses of people who actually move the needle of this country.
Word. Yeah. It's interesting because in these times, like when we talk about, anti-racism work and stuff, we hear a lot of talk about, how it's white people's job to confront white supremacy. And I agree with that, but sometimes I'm just like, okay, well, what do Black people need to be doing? What do we need to, what is our part, not in necessarily dismantling white supremacy, but in pursuing Black liberation? How do you say that? How would you answer that question? What do we need to do?
Right. So we have to organize, right? And organize in a way that is not just even locally, because obviously local is important. But we also have to realize that we're just not just Black people in Detroit, but we're part of a larger diaspora who is oppressed by a system called imperialism or colonialism or capitalism. So it doesn't matter if you're a Black person in Detroit, you're still going to be oppressed if you go to Newark, right? That you're still going to be oppressed if you go to France or the UK or wherever you set your Black foot at. Like, this system that's working to oppress you, right? So one of the things that we're missing from the past, what the Black Panthers did so well, was they was able to have like international solidarity with Black people and oppressed people throughout the world. And one of the next stages that we have to be really diligent upon is making sure that we're building connections with other oppressed folks from other nationalities, and as well as from within our own diaspora, because we're just not going to end this system here in Detroit or here in New York. It's a worldwide system, so it needs a worldwide movement.
Yes. We need to be thinking nationally and globally about national and global problems, you know.
And the thing is, too, unfortunately, I would completely, be frank with you.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's missing from a lot of us American activists, because if you go to the motherland, like, they're paying attention to what's going on over here in America. They know the Trayvon Martins and the Mike Browns and everybody else. Same thing with our Black folk that's in Europe. They know what's going on here in America, but we don't necessarily know what's going on over there. Like, we're so always focused about here in America that we forget that we need to support what's going on over there as well.
As you say that, I feel like a lot of us here are so consumed with, addressing whiteness, that it kind of takes up so much time and energy. Like when I turn the question on us sometimes, and I want to say again, like I affirm everyone who's like, speaking truth to white people. Like I think that's important work. But I remember turning the question on a group of my friends and saying, okay, what do we need to do? And we were all kind of stumped for a while, man. We just kind of sat there for a few minutes, And so I noticed that in your work, I don't think that you're talking to white people. I think that you're talking to us, right? I would love for you to talk about that decision and how you keep that focus and why it's important to you.
Yeah, because anti-Blackness is a system, right? It's an interlocking system of like policies, practices, beliefs, and behaviors that work to oppress Black people for the benefit of white people. So when I first started this work, I started a blog called Black Culture because I really wanted to amplify and celebrate Blackness and give a fuller view of what Blackness was, right? I wanted to capture not just the media type of Blackness that's acceptable, but the fuller Blackness, so people can have those real conversations of what Blackness means and be able to be comfortable in their Blackness and unapologetic about their Blackness. And that meant that I had to have conversations with Black people and this work about Black people. And my focus has always been about Black people and talking to Black people, trying to express how they feel in my own writings, as well as express myself as a Black person in my writings. So like you said, I don't always try to convince white people that, racism exists. That's not what I'm doing. My role is trying to sometimes convince that Black people that not only does racism work, but how does it work and how can we work to dismantle it? And then sometimes white people just happen to catch on as well. And that's good.
Yeah. So what do you think that Black people need to understand about the way that racism works in order to confront it?
Right. I think that we have to realize that it's a system that's a hierarchy, right? And what I mean by that is different levels to it, and that there's always going to be levels in a hierarchical system of domination. And unfortunately, we've always been sold that, we just pull ourselves by the bootstrap and things will be better. For us, for Black people, that would never be the case, because we'll always, no matter how far we climb, even if we're on the top, so-called, we'll still be oppressed. And the only way that we can no longer be oppressed is not about how many rungs up the ladder we climb, but us knocking that whole ladder down.
Yeah. You're talking radical change. We need
radical
something
change.
different. Okay.
But I think like the boys on the block and everybody in the hood realize that. And that's why we have such a low voter turnout, because they realize that it doesn't matter who they elect in that seat. The system is still going to be the same. Like, they're still going to be poor. There's still going to be drugs. There's still going to be shooting, no matter who is in that seat, whether it's Latina, whether it is a black person, whether it's a white person. Maybe the oppression may be a little bit harsher, but things ain't going to be any better for them. So why should they vote? But they don't have the tools in order to combat that. They just give up and do what they do instead of organizing in order to defeat that system.
I want to ask you a couple more questions about movement stuff. And I want to just ask you a couple questions, just like a little bit more personal. So first, like what excites you when you look at what's happening as far as the movement for racial justice?
I think that one of the things that it always excites me is that the young people always excite me, man. The language that they have, the intellect that they have, even in the high school level, it's just like so amazing. It's something that me and my friends always talk about, like, yo, we did not have that language as like a high school kid, Like, we never even thought about doing like a walkout or something to that extent.
Yeah.
Out here in New York, because of a racist incident, this private high school, they actually locked the administration out and did like a sleep-in.
Word, yeah.
So
that was in the Bronx, right?
Yeah, in the Bronx. So they did like a sleep-in for like 2 or 3 days until they had their demands all met. And that was some badass shit. I'm like, damn, like, yo, these kids are bad as hell. And the way they talk about racism and anti-blackness and all this type of language that I didn't have as a kid, like, I only got that as an adult. I'm like, yo, when these guys and when these kids grow up, I'm like, yo, they are really gonna change the world for us.
Yeah.
They're it.
Yeah. I really love that too, and especially because these are black and brown students, right?
Yeah.
See, I love that. I really do, because I feel like my thing, and that excites me too, is because the thing that I'm out here trying to do is help people understand people power, right? People have a misunderstanding. They think that the person at the top of this hierarchy is holding all the power. They don't realize that it's our consent to their rule that empowers them.
Right.
Right. So like that example that you gave, like when that story went out, I was like, y'all, look, this is what I'm talking about. That's dope.
Yeah. It was dope as hell. And then I'm like communicating with them, and like they had their own rules in the school. Like, yo, they make sure that everything's cleaned up. They make sure like people have, jobs to clean up and just jobs to communicate with the press. Like, they was really organized. I'm like, wow. It wasn't like some fun time, crashing up stuff or breaking up stuff in the school. Like, nah, they was really principled and dedicated and determined to win those demands.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask you more, like, what do you think like the world would look like? Like, what does that radical change need to be, in order for us to have a truly anti-racist society?
Right. I think one of those things that we have to think about is access to resources. Mm-hmm. One of the things I always talk about is that police are a central pillar to safety. Mm-hmm. It's access to resources. When you think about the most safe communities in your state or your county, those safest communities don't have more police officers. They just have better housing. They have better education systems. Mm-hmm. They have better jobs. They have better access to healthcare. All these different resources. That's what make a strong and thriving community, not necessarily police. So how do we get to a point where all communities have access to these better and rich resources, and not just a limited few have that access? So when we talk about battling racism and knowing that a part of racism is denying people access to those resources, then we can start to figure out like, what does anti-racist society actually look like and how it actually functions.
So it's not just white and black people hugging each other, is what you're saying.
Right. It's not about white and black people hugging each other, because honestly, like, it can still be like segregated. Like, if people feel happy that way or safer that way, or if that's how they just organized, then that's how it is. But as long as people are being able to have the same level of access to resources, and there's not any violence on any communities based on how they love or how they look. And then that's the type of society I think we should all, be working for.
Yeah, word. I didn't realize we have like kind of a missing link here, right? Like we talked about Black empowerment and we talked about organizing and what the world should look like, but not necessarily the connection between those things, right? Like what's the relationship between organizing and Black empowerment to get there?
Right. I think that's a crucial thing too. Not just organizing, but how we organize. Because in the process of organizing, we're really trying to create the type of world that we want to live in, right?
Yeah.
So if we are organizing in a way that is homophobic or patriarchal or even racist, then we're not building an anti-racist or anti-phobic or, anti-sexist society, right? So even in our organizing, we have to make sure that we are abiding to these same principles and values that we want to see in the world that we're fighting to create. Mm-hmm. So the type of organizations that we're trying to create, like maybe community groups or community town hall meetings, they always have to be centered on the most marginalized people. They always have to be anti-racist, anti-homophobic, and anti-sexist as a core principle.
Yeah.
And that's how we're always trying to move on. Even if we're organizing in the workplace, organizing in the community, we always have to think about those particular type of values in our organizing.
Word.
Otherwise we'll end up in the same place where it's always going to be a hierarchy.
Yeah, yeah. Do you ever feel exhausted doing this work?
Yeah, all the time, man. All the time. You have no idea. Like, exhausted isn't even the word. Like sometimes I get calls like at 4:00 in the morning, 3:00 in the morning, like, hey, Zellie, like such and such happened. Like, can you help me out? And it gets draining sometimes. But like this is, I guess, the life that I chose. So I'm committed to it and committed to our people in our community.
Yeah. How do you keep yourself from, some people they burn out, they quit, and worst case, they may even take their own lives, how do you take care of yourself?
One of the things too is I have to remember that no is a complete sentence, and don't say maybe when you really mean no. Yeah. So when people ask you something, could you do something? If you really don't want to do it, don't be afraid to say no. Don't say maybe, or don't even say yes. If you really mean no, say no, because you know what your capacity is. They don't know your capacity.
Right.
So you have to be able to articulate what your capacity is to people and let them deal with it. Like if they are upset about it, let them be upset, because you have to take care of yourself. Right.
Exactly.
It's almost like on an airplane, they say, you got to put your mask on first before you put on a mask on anybody else.
Whew, yeah, that's a word. That's a word. Bro, I'm so happy about this conversation, man. Thank you so much for taking some time. I want to just ask, I want to leave everybody with one more question. I ask everybody that I interview this question, you know, like, I'm assuming that you still do this work because you feel hopeful in some way.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what gives you hope?
Man, I'm a school teacher, and my students give me hope. My students give me hope, and even their parents give me hope too. Because when I got arrested out here for protesting, even some parents were coming up to me asking me if I was okay and things like that. So I sometimes I forget, like, not only is the world watching, but like my community's watching, and my community's rooting for me too. And that really gives me that extra push to keep going.
Yeah, that's so awesome. Well, Zellie, thanks again, man. I really appreciate it. Where can people find you, keep in touch with you, follow your work?
Yeah, definitely. So you can find me on Twitter and Instagram. My handle is Zellie Imani. You can, follow me there. You can hit me up on there, and we can always build and connect. Because again, that's really important. I'm not one of those high and mighty people that you can't reach out to, but I'm super busy sometimes. So you know how hard it is, like, nail me down. But I'm always down to support people and help people out wherever they are.
No, it doesn't have to be. Doesn't have to be this way. Doesn't have to be. No, it doesn't have to be this way.
So that hit home for me in so many ways, but the concept of encouraging Black folks to do something about injustice and racism without centering white people, man, just for all the reasons that you said up top, were always been hard for me, because coming out of white evangelical spaces, those were my friends, those were my circle. So everything I talked about, they chimed in on. So then when I started talking about race, they're also chiming in on that, and they're white splaining, and they're talking about, they're invalidating things because it's not their experience. And so you spend so much time fighting with them or trying to prove to them that you know what you're talking about. And what I heard from you and Zellie was that is such wasted energy. And I've had to learn that.
It can be.
And when he starts talking about the diaspora, it's like this giant light bulb went off in my head, thinking about how have people in the past talked to diaspora. And there's Peter and Paul and other writers in the Bible who were writing to Jews who were scattered all over and dealing with oppression. And they wrote to them unapologetically.
Yeah.
They wrote in language that they understood.
Yes.
They wrote about their history. They wrote about what it meant to be them and to be empowered. And they wrote about God being for them. And they didn't, they weren't on, there wasn't this like chat back feature back then that we have now.
from Romans.
Yeah, exactly. Romans couldn't just walk up and be like, Paul, actually,
actually, praying Jesus is not a priority to God. Like
I wonder what kind of
people tell me that. Yeah, people say that's kind of stuff to me. Yeah.
I wonder what kind of person. I mean, seeing what we see about Paul, the Apostle Paul, I wonder what kind of person Paul would have been on Facebook. Or Twitter. Like how snarky, how much of a real asshole would Paul have been to people? The way people talk to you and I, like on social media. But I think
it's really interesting for you to put this in the context of saying, like, even looking at the Bible as looking at the letters in the Bible as people from a marginalized group writing to other marginalized people to encourage them, to keep them strong, to keep them inspired, to let them know that God is on their side. And I remember this was months ago. Like, we tried to have this conversation. You, me, Grace Sandra, who's also on our team. If y'all don't know, we used to do these weekly videos on Facebook, and Nandi, another part of our team. And remember when we said, like, how do we do this without censoring white people? And none of us knew how to answer that question at the time.
We didn't know.
You remember that?
I remember we had a whole conversation about it where we were, the subject was not centering whiteness. And I promise it felt like we spent 30 minutes talking about white people.
Yeah. We did. We ended up talking about white people anyway, because when we started talking about what do we need and what do we need to do, we didn't know how to talk about it without talking about white people. And I have a friend, she's a psychologist, African-centered psychologist, and we're going to have her on the show eventually, Dr. Brunel Anderson. And she said, white people and Black people are trauma bonded in America.
Wow.
And so, it takes a lot of work for us to realize that, even for us, it's not all about white people and not all about what white people are doing. And I encountered that a lot. Okay, example. We've been talking about the 3.5% rule a lot with Hope and Hard Pills. We only need that. Studies have shown that no regime has been able to withstand the sustained resistance of 3.5% of the population.
That's amazing.
When we talk about Black liberation in America, we're always saying we don't have enough people. But Black people make up 13% of the American population.
Yeah.
If we only need maybe 3.5%, right? Because we can't say that that's the magic number for every single conflict. It depends. But we know that at least 3.5%. We have well over.
We have plenty. Yeah.
We have plenty,
Yeah.
right? Now, everyone's not going to be a part, but we know that we only need a minority of the whole population. We also only need a minority
Yes.
of our own population,
Exactly.
right? To do it. But when I talk about this, or I mentioned it the other day, I had another good friend, a Black man, saying, well, they don't want us to do this and they don't want us to do that, and they're not going to do this and they're not going to do that. I'm like, we are not talking about them.
Right. But it's so hard not to, man. It is just because that trauma bonding is so real that, like, I mean, how does an abuser talk about their abuse without talking about, I'm sorry, how does the abused talk about their abuse without talking about the abuser? And it's just, they're always there. I think you're right in the idea that they don't need to be centered, but there's just no way to have the conversation without there being a conversation also about white people, or with white people included.
How does the abused talk about their healing without centering their abuser? You know what I mean? Like, you can't talk about the abuse without talking about the abuser. Abuse is a verb. Somebody has to have done it, right? But to talk about what you need to do so that you can be healthy, you're going to have to talk about them some, but it becomes less about trying to convince them of something. Like, you're not trying to convince them of something, right?
Exactly.
Like, you're trying to break free of, the mess that they have introduced to your life and the harm that they've caused to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Zellie also talked about the allies, but in a way, not just in like white allyship. He actually talked about allies with other oppressed or marginalized people groups. And I thought that was really interesting as well, because when you talk about needing 3%, it's not even just that we just need 3% of Black folks. It's like we just need 3% of marginalized people who understand what it is to be oppressed. Now, oppression is not always the same, but the language is the same. And it's the reason why when you get into this work that you find yourself with more attachments to women, to people from the LGBTQ community, because all of those groups know what it is to be othered and to be pushed aside and to be, marginalized and denied rights. So there's a common language that we all have.
Yeah, at least to an extent, right? Like we do understand oppression to an extent. Now we need all groups to understand anti-Blackness so that they're not just like, hey, it's all the same. We're the same, Also, so it's not even just so that, we don't just say we're the same. It's also so that people understand how even among marginalized groups, we can participate in the same kinds of oppressions that have been inflicted upon us. We all have that work to do. But I do really appreciate, I think that question came out of my question about coalition building, because that had been, and it still is, like, it is a question for me about building coalitions. At the time when Zellie and I had that conversation, I was like, I just wasn't sure if Black people and white people could really work together in a meaningful way for racial justice, because of the fact that historically, even white allies have come into movements for Black freedom without confronting their own anti-Blackness and then caused more trouble. Like, they actually inflict the same issues in the Black freedom movement, because they're not being self-aware and self-reflective. I've backed up a little bit off of that, because first off, we need to ask even if coalitions can be built between certain groups of Black people, because, we have issues of, Black people with a superiority complex because they're middle class and they're not poor. We have Black people with a superiority complex because they're straight. We have Black people with a superiority complex because they're men.
Exactly.
Like, you got like Black men who feel like the thing that will save Black people is patriarchy.
We do. Getting back to our place where Black men were men, Yeah, for sure.
Right. Exactly. They're like, what the problem is that, all these women are being feminists, and they think that they're actually human beings, just like the rest of us black men.
How dare they think they're human beings,
dude? Bro,
yeah,
like that. I don't think you're talking about freedom.
Well, dude, and that is what is hard sometimes, is that, you know, we always say this: black people are not a monolith, but there being so many black folks and ways of thinking and ways of being black in America that go all the way to your Candace Owens of the world, who is a black woman.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got probably the other end of the spectrum where you and I tend to lean more, or your Bree Newsome's and Angela Rye's. Those are all black women, and they could not be more different. And so the frustrating part for me is the Candace Owens end of the spectrum, because
I know,
I don't know what to do with that end. Because naturally, honestly, as a human, I want to hate them, because I feel like they're so detrimental to our forward movement. But if I zoom out of that and I think about it objectively, they probably believe that they're doing good for the culture. And that's a challenge for me. It's like, and then there's also, like you said, black folks that like will say the most ignorant, uninformed, non-thought out things about women, about gays, about you name it. And you're like, yeah, that's not helping us either.
Yeah. I mean, to your point about, what do you do with black people who are participants in white supremacy? And I think you're being really generous, honestly, to people like Candace Owens, because I don't know that all black people that do that actually are trying to better the lives of black people.
I'm trying not to hate her, man. I'm trying.
I'm not saying that she doesn't. I don't know her, but I'm not sure that a lot of black people that do that are actually trying to better the lives of black people. We talk about the linked fate idea in black communities, where there are some black people who understand there's some black people that understand our lives as being interconnected as black people. So we're all going to be affected. And there's some black people who are really, at least they hope, to rise above that, right? Or to live outside of that, or to disprove that in some way. And so I do think that there are some black people who they're out for themselves, and they think that they can just navigate the system. They might be able to exploit it or take advantage of it. And they're not really thinking about the rest of black people, because at the end of the day, speaking truth to power is good, but in itself, it will not bring about the changes that we need. We need a revolution. And I've shied away from saying that because it feels grandiose, right? But when we talk about the kind of changes that we need in the world, we need to stop an existential crisis, or at least avoid the worst case scenario for all of the species that live on this planet. We need to rethink the way that we eat, the way that our economic system is set up, the way that we handle criminal justice, all these things. We're not talking about small reforms. We're talking about finding a new way to live on this planet. At the end of the day, there is no amount of tweeting that is going to do that.
Right.
And so I see that sometimes the temptation is for us to engage in certain behaviors and certain activities, and to kind of be self-righteous about it sometimes, to kind of be nasty about it sometimes. And we justify it by saying, well, I'm right, I'm correct. And you might be correct, but are you wielding power to actually change the situation?
That's tough, man.
You can be correct and kids still be locked up in cages. You can be correct and we keep pumping carbon into the atmosphere. You can be correct and we keep incarcerating Black people at a disproportionate rate to their white counterparts. And you can be right on Twitter all day. you know?
Yeah. Well, I'll just say it this way. And, it's my opinion that some of the way of thinking about what you have to do just to get by feels antiquated to me. But I do agree with the idea that we need all kinds. We need both. We need both the protesters and the strategists. We need the street preachers. We need the wagon with the rock in it, with the boulder in it. Mm-hmm. And we also need people who are dealing with legislation with their local government and state government.
Absolutely.
So I think we need all of it. And I think one of the things that winds up happening that really gets disheartening, especially when in light of that we needed 3% of the population or whatever to move us forward. One of the things that gets frustrating in that is these two ethics oftentimes tend to throw rocks at one another and go, you should do it this way because this is the way change happens. And no, you shouldn't, because that's never been the case. And Dr. King did this, but Dr. King also did this. And you have this back and forth tug of war, even with our heroes. Like Dr. King could be dragged into an ethic of responsibility or ultimate ends, depending on how you're looking at his life. And you can discredit the ways that he did the opposite. And so I think it's important that we recognize that all of those things are needed. We just need to really have people who understand nuance enough to have these kind of conversations that lead to us saying, okay, I see what you're doing and I see what you're doing, and let's put this thing together and do this thing. And that's a step forward.
Well, I think that the problem in joining some of these, first off, let me say, yes, we need a lot of different people who are taking a lot of different stances and different types of actions to be working together. Like Eric McBay talks about how social movements are an ecosystem, and in an ecosystem, you got a lot of different kinds of organisms, and exactly what you're saying. You got a lion yelling at a flamingo for not being a lion. You know what I mean? Like, flamingo's like, you try to change the world. Where your claws at? You ain't even got no mane. Let me hear you roar, flamingo. Pink's not a revolutionary color. What's wrong with you?
You can't even roar. Flamingo, like, you can't even fly. I can get somewhere further and faster than you can.
So I mean that is a huge problem.
I think, man, that is so. As to me, is one of the takeaways for me that I think is really important for me anyway. Is just to say, what can I be engaged in locally that can help move this forward? And even if I'm really committed to the work, do I live somewhere where my local effort doesn't even really mean anything? Should I move somewhere else? Should I move my locale so that I can be engaged in work that's really meaningful to me?
I love that. To the question, like, what do Black people need to do? I mean, there are many things that Black people can do that are legitimate. And I do feel like, first and foremost, Black people need to survive and do what brings them joy, because you can't just live your entire life fighting white supremacy.
No way.
But we also do need to fight. And I love that Zellie talks about organizing and the importance of organizing for our own freedom. Well, thanks for listening to this episode of the Hope and Hard Pills podcast. As always, we love having these conversations, and we're so glad that you're a part. Thank you to our wonderful patrons on Patreon who helped to make this show possible. And shout out to our editor and producer, Ross Montgomery. You'll hear from him in a second to tell you how you can become a patron if you want to get the uncut versions of these episodes and if you want to get them early. All right, talk to you later.
Thank you for listening today. If you like what you heard and you haven't already, please subscribe on your favorite podcatcher. Leaving a rating or review on Apple Podcasts also helps us get into more ears and minds. This podcast is made possible by our fantastic patrons. Thank you for being a part of our work at Hope and Hard Pills. As usual, you'll get the uncut extended version of this episode on Patreon. If you want to join in the work on our Patreon community, just look us up at patreon.com/Andre Henry. To go deeper, get subscribed to our email newsletter. Head over to andrerhenry.com and click Join the Movement, where you'll get practical insight on anti-racism and social change every week. And you'll never miss a new article, song, or podcast episode. You can also follow Andre Henry on Facebook and Instagram at The Andre Henry. Connect with Alicia on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Alicia T. Crosby and her website, aliciatcrosby.com. That's all for this episode of the Hope and Hard Pills podcast. See you next time. Peace.
know you